Imagine you're living in ancient Greece around 100 BC. Life is simple, but out of nowhere, the king's soldiers grab you and drag you to a terrifying copper bull. You're forced inside, and a fire is lit beneath you. As the bronze heats up, you're roasted alive, with your screams echoing through the streets, sounding like a bull's roar. This was just one of many gruesome ways people were made to suffer throughout history. Let's take a horrifying look at some of the most painful deaths ever recorded. Number 1. Julius Caesar. Let's kick things off with Julius Caesar, one of the most famous deaths in history. He wasn't dragged to a brutal fate by guards, but instead was betrayed by his own friends and allies in 44 BC. Imagine standing there, knowing you're in danger, but being stabbed 23 times by your closest companions. That's exactly what happened to Caesar on the Ides of March. It wasn't the slowest or most painful death on this list, but betrayal adds a special kind of sting, doesn't it? Number 2. William Wallace. Now, let's jump to the dramatic end of William Wallace, the Scottish hero immortalized in the movie Braveheart. After leading the Scottish in a rebellion against the English, Wallace was captured in 1305 and sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. Just to be clear, this doesn't mean they were being generous and dividing him into shares. This execution involved hanging him, but not to death, followed by disembowelment, and then cutting him into 4 parts. His head was then placed on a spike on London Bridge. Number 3. Giles Corey. The Salem witch trials were a dark chapter in American history, but few suffered like Giles Corey. Accused of witchcraft, Corey refused to enter a plea, and the authorities decided to force him to talk in a particularly ancient way. Peine forte et dure, this lovely form of torture, involved placing heavy stones on his chest until he gave in. Corey never surrendered. Instead, he lay there, grinding his teeth as he slowly crushed to death. Talk about stubbornness in the face of agonizing pain. Number 4. Mohammed Mesfewi. In Morocco, serial killer Mohammed Mesfewi got what many considered a fitting punishment for his crimes in 1906. Originally sentenced to crucifixion, which was still used at the time, foreign diplomats stopped and called it too cruel. Instead, Mesfewi was sealed inside a small wall in the active Marrakesh Bazaar, a process called immurement. Before being sealed up, Mesfewi was whipped, adding insult to injury. For 2 days, his muffled screams echoed out from his tomb before he gave up to dehydration. It's hard to imagine the horror of slowly dying, trapped in the middle of a busy market, with no hope of escape.
Number 5.
Scaphism. One of the most miserable ways to die was scaphism, used by the ancient Persian Empire around 500 BC. Victims were trapped between 2 hollowed-out boats, coated with honey, and left to be slowly eaten alive by insects. They eventually died from dehydration, shock, and insanity. This torturous death stretched over days, making it a horrifyingly slow and painful end. Number 6. Grigory Rasputin. Grigory Rasputin might just be the hardest man in history to kill. This Russian mystic had to be poisoned, shot, and drowned before finally losing to death in 1916. His assassins laced his food and drink with cyanide, but Rasputin seemed to brush it off like it was nothing. They shot him once, but he survived that too. Eventually, he was shot several more times and tossed into the freezing river, where he finally met his end. The sheer amount of suffering Rasputin went through before his body gave in is what made his death story the stuff of legends and myths. Number 7. Franz Schmitz. In the late 1500s and early 1600s, famous executioner Franz Schmidt employed one of the most brutal methods known to man, being ripped apart by trees. Imagine being tied to 2 young trees, 1 hand and 1 leg to each tree. Then the trees are bent and tied down. When released, the trees snap back into place, and well, you can imagine what happens next. The victim's body was literally torn apart. The intense pain of being ripped limb from limb, absolutely horrifying. Number 8. Robert François Damiens. In 1757, Robert François attempted to assassinate King Louis XV of France, but what followed was one of the most gruesome executions ever carried out. After being tortured with red-hot clamps, Damiens was tied to 4 horses, each pulling in a different direction. His body was slowly torn apart in front of a crowd. It was a long, painful process, and by the time it was over, Damiens was barely recognizable. Number 9. Balthazar Gerard. Balthasar Gerard's assassination of William of Orange in 1584 landed him in the pages of history for one of the most torturous deaths imaginable. After his capture, he was tortured with hot branding irons and had parts of his flesh flayed off. But it didn't end there. Gerard was ultimately dismembered by horses in what became one of the most brutal executions of the time. His suffering was planned out over several days, with each passing hour bringing more horrible pain. There are bad deaths, and then there's this. Number 10. Hisashi Ochi. Fast forward to modern times, and we encounter Hisashi Ochi, who suffered one of the worst radiation-related deaths in history after a nuclear accident in 1999. Uchi's body was exposed to massive radiation, which caused his cells to break down and his skin to peel off. Although it was clear he could not recover, doctors kept him alive for nearly 3 months at his family's request. He underwent countless procedures, enduring unimaginable pain as his body slowly disintegrated. It was one of the most prolonged and agonizing ways to die in modern history. Number 11. Brazen Bull. The Brazen Bull, one of the cruelest execution methods from ancient times. In the 500 SBC, it was said to have been created for the tyrant Phalaris of Sicily. The punished were placed inside the hollow metal bull, and a fire was lit underneath. Slowly, the metal heated up, and the person inside was roasted alive. Their screams were constructed to sound like the bellowing of a bull. Whether it truly existed or not, just the thought of slowly cooking to death inside a metal bull is enough to make your skin crawl. Number 12. Peter Neers. In the late 16th century, Peter Neers, a famous German serial killer, was finally captured after years of terrorizing the countryside. His punishment was nothing short of horrific. First, his skin was ripped off with hot clamps, then he was roasted alive over a flame. Just to make sure he endured maximum pain, his limbs were broken to ensure maximum suffering before he was finally left to die. Number 13. György Dosa, a Hungarian leader who led a failed peasant protest in 1514. His death was not only painful, but also deeply humiliating. Captured after his defeat, Dosa was seated on a burning iron throne as an insult to his royal goals. To add to the pain, he was forced to wear a red-hot iron crown, and his flesh was burned before being fed to fellow prisoners. The sheer cruelty of making Dosa suffer while mocking him makes this one of the most brutal executions ever recorded. Number 14. Jan Palach. In 1969, Jan Palach, a 20-year-old Czech student, set himself on fire to protest Soviet occupation. He poured gasoline on himself and lit a match in Prague's Wenceslas Square. Though he survived for 3 agonizing days, 85% of his body was covered in burns. The excruciating pain of severe burns is considered one of the worst kinds of human suffering, and Palach's choice became a symbol of resistance, though at a terrible personal cost. In the end, these brutal executions show how far societies have gone to establish fear and punishment. Whether roasted alive, crushed by stones, or eaten by insects, these methods of death remind us of humanity's darker past, where suffering was customized into a cruel and painful spectacle.